Daniel Harper lived on the corner of Drive, a street lined with modest, well-kept homes. His house was a quiet sanctuary, surrounded by flowering shrubs and a neatly paved driveway that led to a heavy wrought-iron gate. The gate was not just an ornament, it was a symbol of his privacy, a boundary that separated his personal space from the constant flow of neighborhood life. For years, the gate had been a minor source of tension. Some neighbors casually used the driveway as a shortcut, cutting through to the back street when traffic became congested. Daniel had noticed this over time and politely asked them to avoid using his property. Most, though a few were bold enough to ignore his requests. For him, the issue was simple: his driveway, his rules. He never imagined this quiet insistence would lead to a confrontation with the neighborhood association. The trouble began subtly, with a polite letter slid under his gate one sunny morning. It was from the Homeowners Association, written in a formal tone, requesting that Daniel keep his gate unlocked for the convenience of the community. The letter suggested that the closed gate disrupted the uniform appearance of Drive and interfered with neighborhood accessibility. Daniel read it twice, then leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. He understood the point, but he could not ignore his own needs. Privacy, he believed, was a right worth defending. The next few days brought an uncomfortable awareness. Daniel began to notice the subtle stares from neighbors while he walked his dog in the evenings. Children on bicycles would pause at the gate, unsure whether to continue on the path they had always taken. The association began circulating flyers about an upcoming meeting, emphasizing community harmony and neighborly cooperation. Daniel knew that when the meeting arrived, the situation would escalate. Despite the looming pressure, Daniel remained calm. He spent evenings reviewing the bylaws of the association, making careful notes about his rights as a property owner. He discovered that the association had rules about maintaining property appearance and access, but nothing explicitly required him to unlock his gate. Knowledge provided comfort, and Daniel felt a growing sense of confidence. He realized that this was more than a dispute over a gate. It was a test of personal boundaries and resolve. On the morning of the meeting, Daniel dressed in a simple shirt and slacks, carrying a folder containing copies of the property deed and the relevant bylaws. As he approached the community center, he saw familiar faces. Neighbors who had once greeted him warmly now gave him hesitant nods or avoided eye contact entirely. The air was thick with anticipation, the hum of polite conversation masking the tension that lay beneath. Daniel could feel the weight of expectation pressing on him, yet he remained composed. Inside the meeting room, the association members had arranged themselves at a long table, papers neatly stacked before them. The president, Mrs., smiled politely as she addressed the gathering. "We are here to discuss an issue that affects all of us," she said, gesturing toward Daniel. "The closed gate on Mr. Harper's property has caused concern, and we are seeking a resolution that benefits the entire community." Daniel listened attentively, nodding slightly but saying nothing. When it was his turn to speak, he rose slowly, his hands resting on the back of a chair. "I understand the association's perspective," he began, his voice steady, "but my gate is on private property. I value the security and privacy it provides, and I cannot, in good conscience, leave it open at all times." His words were calm, measured, and devoid of hostility. A murmur ran through the room. Some neighbors whispered to one another, while others frowned in frustration. Daniel continued, citing the bylaws he had studied and explaining that no rule required him to comply with the request. "I am willing to discuss compromise solutions, such as scheduled access for certain events, but I cannot simply unlock the gate permanently," he concluded. The meeting ended with polite nods and a promise from the board to consider his position. Yet Daniel left with a sense that this was only the beginning. The subtle tension in the air hinted at the challenges ahead. As he walked back home, the gate gleaming in the afternoon sun, he felt a mixture of apprehension and quiet determination. His corner of Drive might become the center of a larger struggle, but Daniel Harper had already made up his mind. His gate would remain closed, and he would defend it with patience and integrity. After the first meeting, the quiet tension in Drive only intensified. Daniel Harper returned to his home, closing the gate behind him, but the world outside seemed different. The air carried an unusual sharpness, and the laughter of children playing on the street felt muted, almost cautious. It was as if his decision to keep the gate closed had shifted the rhythm of the neighborhood, creating ripples he hadn't anticipated. Word of Daniel's firm stance traveled quickly. Flyers appeared on doors, posted with neat handwriting, reminding residents of an upcoming community gathering to resolve the gate issue. At first, Daniel tried to ignore it, focusing on his morning routine, the scent of fresh coffee filling his kitchen as he reviewed property papers and community bylaws. Yet he could not escape the subtle signs of attention. Neighbors who once waved as they passed now slowed their pace, offering polite but distant nods. Conversations paused mid-sentence when he approached. The sense of being observed, though unspoken, pressed against him like a weight. Daniel knew this reaction was partly human curiosity and partly the influence of the homeowners association. Mrs., the association president, had a talent for rallying opinions without overtly appearing forceful. She spoke of community harmony and neighborly cooperation, painting the locked gate as an inconvenience rather than a boundary. Daniel, however, saw through it. The concern for harmony was a gentle form of pressure, designed to make residents feel uncomfortable with standing alone. Over the next week, Daniel received more correspondence from the association. Each letter carried the same polite tone, but the underlying message was clear. Compliance was expected. Some letters hinted at fines, others suggested that prolonged resistance could lead to escalating actions. Daniel read each carefully, marking the points that mattered. He reminded himself that the letters contained no legal obligation to comply. Knowledge, he realized, was his strongest defense. Despite the mounting pressure, Daniel did not feel anger. Instead, he felt a quiet resolve. His corner of drive had always been a place of calm, a refuge from the hustle beyond the neighborhood. The gate was a simple line drawn to protect that space. He refused to let polite threats and whispers dictate the terms of his home life. Still, he understood the need to act thoughtfully. Rash decisions would only fuel resentment and increase tension. Patience, he decided, would be more powerful than confrontation. Neighbors began to approach him individually, seeking small compromises. Some asked if they could walk through the driveway during the day. Others inquired about bicycle access for children. Daniel listened to each request, nodding politely but always responded with gentle firmness. "I understand and I appreciate your position," he said, "but my gate must remain closed for privacy. I am open to discussing specific, scheduled access if needed, but it cannot be open all the time." His tone was consistent, calm, reasoned, and unwavering. The neighborhood itself began to show signs of adjustment. Streets that had been busy with shortcuts became quieter. Residents who once relied on Daniel's driveway found alternate routes, discovering that what had seemed inconvenient at first was manageable. Still, the tension lingered like a faint shadow over Drive. Whispers in gardens and at bus stops reminded Daniel that he had become the focus of a growing conversation. Amid the pressure, Daniel found unexpected support. A few neighbors quietly expressed admiration for his patience and integrity. They recognized the courage it took to stand firm while facing subtle social pressure. Their encouragement reminded him that he was not alone, even if the majority had initially leaned toward frustration. It reinforced his belief that personal boundaries, maintained with respect, were worth defending. By the end of the week, Daniel realized that the situation had become more than a dispute over a gate. It was a reflection of differing values: personal space versus convenience, patience versus pressure, principle versus compliance. As he stood behind his locked gate one evening, watching the sun set across Drive, he felt a sense of clarity. He would face the coming challenges without aggression or fear. The association could voice their concerns and neighbors could express theirs, but the gate would remain closed. This was not stubbornness. It was the quiet assertion of rights, grounded in patience, knowledge, and careful thought. And Daniel Harper, standing alone yet unshaken, understood that the weeks ahead would test more than just the gate. They would test the balance of power, the limits of influence, and ultimately, the patience and ingenuity required to maintain control over his own home. The following week, Drive seemed unusually quiet. Daniel Harper could sense it from the moment he stepped outside in the morning. The hum of, the chatter of children, even the distant hum of passing cars, all seemed to fade against the tension building around his closed gate. The Homeowners Association had called another official meeting, and this time, Daniel knew, the stakes were higher. Arriving at the community center, Daniel immediately noticed the energy in the room. Chairs were neatly arranged in rows, and the long table where the board usually sat was now stacked with papers, letters, and reports. Neighbors had gathered early, whispering in small groups. Some approached Daniel politely, trying to gauge his mood, while others avoided eye contact entirely. There was a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and anticipation that hung in the air like static before a storm. Mrs. the association president rose as the clock struck 7. Her presence commanded attention, and she began the meeting with her usual calm, deliberate tone. "We are here to discuss an issue that affects the entire community," she said, glancing toward Daniel. "The closed gate on Mr. Harper's property has caused inconvenience and concern for residents who rely on access through his driveway. Our goal tonight is to find a solution that works for everyone." Daniel listened quietly, taking in the statements of board members who spoke in support of the association's position. One neighbor argued passionately about the extra time needed to drive around the block, while another mentioned the difficulties for children commuting to school. The voices blended into a chorus of frustration, a chorus that seemed louder simply because Daniel had remained silent. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel rose slowly, ensuring that his demeanor reflected calm authority rather than defensiveness. "I understand the concerns raised here tonight," he began, his voice steady and measured. "I also understand the association's position. However, my property, including this gate, is my own. It provides security, privacy, and peace of mind for my household. I cannot compromise that by keeping it permanently unlocked." A murmur of surprise ran through the room. Some neighbors frowned, while others nodded in quiet agreement. Daniel continued, referencing the community bylaws he had studied thoroughly. "The bylaws do not require me to provide unrestricted access. While I am open to discussing specific, scheduled access for certain situations, the gate must remain closed otherwise. This is not about inconvenience. It is about maintaining personal boundaries responsibly and legally." The discussion quickly became heated. Voices rose, papers rustled, and a few neighbors challenged Daniel directly, insisting that fairness required him to yield. Daniel responded without anger, calmly repeating his points. "I respect your right to express concerns, but respecting the rules and boundaries that protect individual property is equally important. I am not opposed to compromise, but it must be reasonable and balanced." As the meeting progressed, tensions became palpable. Mrs. tried to mediate, suggesting compromises such as temporary opening for school drop-offs or community events. Daniel acknowledged each idea, but he explained why they would not work long-term. The conversation grew more intense, with board members pressing for compliance while Daniel held firm. At one point, a neighbor raised the possibility of fines, prompting Daniel to ask for legal clarification, which he had anticipated. "Any enforcement must align with the governing documents," he said, producing a copy of the association bylaws. "I am prepared to comply with the law, but not with arbitrary demands." By the end of the evening, no resolution had been reached. The board reluctantly adjourned the meeting, leaving Daniel standing quietly, collecting his papers. He felt the weight of the room's gaze, but remained composed. The tension had escalated, and it was clear that the association would not relent easily. But Daniel had also planted seeds of doubt. He had demonstrated knowledge, patience, and the courage to stand firm without escalating conflict unnecessarily. As he walked back to his home, the neighborhood felt both familiar and changed. Conversations continued behind closed doors, and subtle glances followed him along the sidewalk. Daniel knew that this was a turning point. The association had pushed, and he had resisted. But the next steps, he realized, required more than firmness. They required strategy, insight, and perhaps a quiet solution no one had anticipated. Standing behind his locked gate, Daniel watched the last rays of the sun reflect off the wrought iron bars. The conflict was far from over, but he felt a growing sense of confidence. The board could pressure, persuade, or complain, but the gate remained his domain. And Daniel Harper, patient, prepared, and resolute, knew he was only beginning to explore the possibilities that lay beyond the next challenge. The days after the heated meeting passed with a strange quiet on Drive. The usual sounds of chatter and laughter seemed muted, as though the neighborhood was holding its collective breath. Daniel Harper, however, was far from idle. Behind the locked gate of his corner property, he had begun what he called his research project. He wanted to ensure that the next steps he took were informed, strategic, and unassailable. Daniel spent evenings poring over property records at the county office. He had always been meticulous with legal documents, and now that skill was proving invaluable. As he flipped through deeds, surveys, and plat maps, he noticed something unusual about the street that everyone used as a shortcut. The strip of pavement cutting across his property and connecting to the main thoroughfare appeared frequently in documents. But in every instance, it was described as part of a development that had never been fully transferred to the homeowners association or the city. Curiosity quickly turned to careful investigation. Daniel traced the ownership history of the street back decades, studying public records and developer notes. What he discovered thrilled him in a quiet, controlled way. The street was technically still listed under the name of the original developer. In practical terms, it had been used as a public shortcut for years, but legally no one, neither the association nor the city, had a valid claim of ownership. This realization changed everything. Daniel understood that the street was, in fact, purchasable. It was an opportunity that had been hidden in plain sight, overlooked because everyone assumed the road belonged to the neighborhood or the city. A smile crept across his face. Where others saw conflict and frustration, he saw a solution, and one that shifted the balance of power entirely. The idea was simple but powerful. If he could purchase the street legally, he would gain control of the very path the association had insisted must remain open. He would no longer be merely defending his gate. He would be the owner of the route that had caused so much tension. It was a bold move, but Daniel had spent years preparing for moments that required precision, patience, and quiet courage. After confirming the legal status with county officials, Daniel set the plan in motion. He submitted the necessary applications, arranged for surveys, and prepared to purchase the street in his name. Everything had to be meticulous. One mistake, one overlooked detail, and the opportunity would slip away. As he signed forms and reviewed documents, he felt a rare thrill of anticipation. The purchase would not just be a personal victory. It would demonstrate the importance of knowledge, preparation, and calm assertiveness in the face of pressure. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued its routine, unaware of the shift quietly taking place. Daniel observed from his porch as neighbors drove their cars, children biked past, and board members conducted meetings about the gate issue. None suspected that Daniel's research was moving beyond mere defense into a realm where he would redefine control entirely. Evenings were spent checking on the progress of the purchase, confirming every detail and imagining the reactions once the ownership was complete. Daniel understood the gravity of the decision. This was not about revenge. It was about establishing a principle. That persistence, intelligence, and careful action could turn a situation in one's favor without aggression or hostility. Finally, the day arrived when the paperwork was completed. Daniel had acquired the legal rights to the street that everyone relied on. He held the deeds in his hands, the weight of the moment sinking in. For the first time, he felt the quiet satisfaction of total control, knowing that the balance had shifted. The gate that had once been a point of contention was now part of a larger, more significant assertion of rights. Standing behind his own locked gate, Daniel looked out over the street he now owned. It had been a path of conflict, debate, and frustration for weeks, but now it was a symbol of opportunity and foresight. He realized that his actions had not just secured his own property. They had quietly prepared him for the coming confrontation, one in which knowledge, patience, and precision would matter more than force or argument. Daniel Harper had turned a moment of tension into an advantage that no meeting, flyer, or complaint could undo. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he stood silently, imagining the upcoming reactions, the next HOA meeting, and the eventual moment when he would reveal the full extent of his discovery. The quiet thrill of strategy and anticipation filled him with a calm confidence. Drive was about to change, and Daniel was ready to lead that change without raising his voice, without anger, and without compromise to principle. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Daniel Harper decided the moment had arrived. The deed to the street, carefully signed and recorded, rested in his folder at home. He had considered how best to inform the neighborhood, knowing that the revelation would ripple through the community in ways no meeting or flyer ever could. There was no rush, no dramatics. Daniel preferred precision, clarity, and the quiet authority that came from being fully prepared. He walked to the entrance of the street and posted a single notice, simple and unambiguous. Private road, access by permission only. The white paper, bold letters carefully printed, stood out against the green hedge lining the street. Daniel stepped back and watched from a distance, noting how the morning sunlight caught the sign, making it impossible to miss. Almost immediately, the reactions began. A few early risers slowed their cars, confused, reading the notice over and over. Others parked at the end of the street, stepping out to inspect the sign, murmuring to one another in a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Word traveled quickly. By mid-morning, several neighbors had already arrived at Daniel's gate, peering through the wrought iron bars, hesitant but seeking answers. Daniel opened the gate just enough to speak without leaving the safety of his property. His demeanor was calm, his tone deliberate. "The street is now privately owned," he explained simply. "Access will be granted according to schedule and necessity, but it cannot remain open indefinitely." His words were measured, firm, and entirely free of anger. The reactions varied. Some neighbors, initially frustrated, began to express understanding. They recognized the legal legitimacy of Daniel's actions and the thoughtfulness behind his decision. Others, however, were less composed. Murmurs of discontent rippled through the crowd, and the association's influence became immediately apparent as the news reached Mrs. and the board members. By mid-afternoon, the association called an emergency meeting. Daniel, aware that the gathering would be convened, chose to attend, not to argue or negotiate, but to present the facts calmly. As he walked into the room, the tension was palpable. Board members shifted in their seats, neighbors whispered in corners, and a few faces bore the unmistakable signs of panic. Daniel's presence, composed and confident, immediately drew attention. Mrs. began the meeting with her usual formality, though her voice betrayed a hint of strain. "We are here to discuss the recent developments regarding the street," she said, glancing briefly at Daniel. "We have concerns about accessibility and community cohesion." Daniel listened quietly, nodding in acknowledgement, then rose when it was his turn to speak. "I understand your concerns," he said, his voice calm and measured. "However, the street was legally purchased and is now under my ownership. The law supports my rights as the owner, just as the bylaws protect individual property rights. This decision ensures clarity, security, and the proper management of the street." The room fell silent. A few board members fumbled through papers, attempting to find counter-arguments. Residents whispered to one another, some impressed by Daniel's careful preparation, others frustrated by the inconvenience now imposed upon them. The meeting quickly revealed the limits of the board's influence. Their prior authority over access was now moot. In the days following the announcement, the neighborhood adjusted to the new reality. Drivers found alternate routes, children biked along longer paths, and the association scrambled to update residents about the legal situation. Daniel's gate remained locked, and the street, once a shortcut for convenience, became a quiet demonstration of thoughtful strategy and legal foresight. Despite the initial shock, a subtle change began to take root. Some neighbors approached Daniel to request scheduled access for specific needs, and he accommodated reasonable requests with careful planning. Others accepted the situation as a new normal. The neighborhood, while momentarily disrupted, gradually adapted to the rules established by Daniel's quiet but decisive action. As evening fell, Daniel returned to his porch, watching the sunlight fade across the street now officially under his ownership. He felt a calm satisfaction, a recognition that patience, knowledge, and careful planning had created a resolution that was firm, fair, and unassailable. The announcement had been made, the rules were clear, and for the first time in weeks, the tension that had weighed on Drive began to lift, replaced by the understanding that the situation had changed permanently, and in a way that could not be undone by pressure or complaint. Daniel Harper, standing behind his locked gate, smiled faintly. The neighborhood had learned an important lesson in patience, preparation, and respect for property rights. And Daniel knew, quietly and confidently, that this was only the beginning of a transformation that would extend far beyond a single gate or a single street. In the days following Daniel Harper's announcement, Drive settled into a new rhythm, one marked by curiosity, frustration, and a growing awareness that the neighborhood's balance of power had shifted. What had once been a simple shortcut through his corner property was now a legally owned street under his authority. The gates remained closed, and the sign declaring private ownership stood as a quiet but unmistakable statement. The initial shock among residents began to give way to real inconvenience. Drivers who had relied on the shortcut for years now found themselves navigating longer routes, weaving through side streets and detours. School drop-offs, grocery trips, and evening commutes all required extra time. Some neighbors approached Daniel with requests for temporary access. He considered each carefully, granting a few on a schedule and politely declining others, always maintaining his calm, measured tone. Not everyone responded with understanding. A group of neighbors approached the association with complaints, suggesting that Daniel's actions were unfair or disruptive. The board convened another meeting to discuss potential remedies, but they quickly realized that the law and Daniel's careful planning was firmly on his side. Every suggestion for intervention was met with the cold clarity of property records and deeds. No argument could override legal ownership. The association's attempts to challenge the situation created a visible tension in the neighborhood. Meetings became heated, with voices rising and tempers flaring, but Daniel chose to remain composed. He did not need to attend every gathering or respond to every complaint. His quiet confidence and preparation meant that he had already anticipated most of the board's strategies, leaving him free to observe without reacting hastily. Daniel also noticed subtle shifts among the residents themselves. Some, initially critical of his actions, began to see the fairness in his approach. His decisions were consistent, predictable, and grounded in law and principle. Others remained frustrated, grumbling about inconvenience and missed shortcuts, but even they had to acknowledge that Daniel had acted responsibly and without malice. The street had been transformed into a managed, orderly space, one in which boundaries were respected, and access was granted with fairness rather than assumption. As tensions simmered, Daniel decided to reinforce his control physically and symbolically. He installed reinforced locks and new fencing along the property line, along with clear signage indicating private ownership. It was not an aggressive move, but a practical one, ensuring clarity for anyone approaching the street. He also prepared a schedule for neighbors who required temporary access, posting it in a visible location at the gate. The system was fair, structured, and transparent, leaving little room for misunderstanding or dispute. Despite the friction, Daniel's actions began to have a subtle effect on the community culture. Residents who had once assumed entitlement to shortcuts and convenience were now learning patience and respect for property rights. The association, too, was reminded that authority has limits when faced with knowledge, preparation, and calm, consistent action. Drive, once tense and divided, began to experience a cautious equilibrium, a new order built not on fear or anger but on clarity and principle. Evenings became Daniel's favorite time of day. Standing on his porch behind the locked gate, he observed the neighborhood adjusting to the new reality. Children rode their bikes along longer paths, families discovered alternate routes, and the streets, though quieter, felt more controlled, more organized. He reflected on the lessons of patience, preparation, and assertiveness, recognizing that the change had not come from confrontation but from careful strategy and foresight. By the end of the week, a strange but undeniable transformation had occurred. The neighborhood had learned, sometimes reluctantly, that Daniel's boundaries were firm and fair. The street remained closed, the gate remained locked, and the daily rhythms had adjusted. The balance of power had shifted, not with noise or spectacle, but through methodical planning, legal precision, and quiet confidence. Daniel Harper, standing silently behind his gate, felt a sense of calm satisfaction. The neighborhood was no longer caught in a struggle over access. It was learning the value of respecting boundaries, the power of preparation, and the importance of measured, consistent action. The street he now controlled had become more than just a road. It was a symbol of principle, patience, and the quiet strength required to maintain it. As the sun set, casting long shadows across Drive, Daniel knew that the next challenge would come. The neighborhood would adjust, adapt, and perhaps test the limits of his patience, but he was ready. The The streets, the gate, and the principles behind them were now firmly under his control, and Daniel Harper understood that true influence was not about force. It was about strategy, clarity, and resolve. The day of the Homeowners Association's annual meeting arrived with a sense of anticipation that had not been felt in Drive for years. The news of Daniel Harper's purchase of the street had circulated rapidly, and residents, board members, and curious neighbors alike were eager to see what would unfold. The community center buzzed with whispers and speculation, chairs filling quickly as everyone took their seats. The air was charged with expectation. Daniel arrived calmly, carrying only a folder with his documentation. He wore a simple shirt and slacks, projecting the same quiet confidence he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. He was not there to argue or provoke. He was there to present facts and demonstrate the clarity of his position. Yet the energy in the room suggested that this meeting would not be routine. The previous weeks of tension, inconvenience, and curiosity had all built toward this moment. The association president, called the meeting to order with her customary formality, though her tone carried a faint edge. "We are gathered to discuss matters concerning the street adjacent to Mr. Harper's property," she began, glancing briefly at him. "It has come to our attention that significant changes have occurred regarding ownership and access. Our goal is to address the situation in a fair and orderly manner." As the discussion began, board members and neighbors alike voiced concerns, complaints, and questions. Some spoke of daily inconveniences, others of tradition, and a few even suggested that Daniel's actions had disrupted the spirit of community cooperation. Throughout it all, Daniel remained seated, listening carefully, taking notes when necessary, and maintaining the calm composure that had become his hallmark. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel rose slowly, projecting authority without aggression. "I understand the concerns raised here tonight," he began, his voice clear and deliberate. "However, the facts are straightforward. The street in question was legally purchased and is now privately owned. My ownership is supported by the county records, the property deed, and applicable laws. Access will be managed in a fair and orderly manner, but the street cannot remain open without oversight." The room was momentarily silent. Some neighbors exchanged glances, while others nodded quietly, beginning to grasp the legitimacy of his position. Daniel continued, calmly explaining the schedule he had established for temporary access and the reasons behind it. "This is not a punitive measure," he said. "It is a practical, lawful, and fair approach that balances neighborhood convenience with the rights of property ownership." Mrs. attempted to challenge him, citing community tradition and alleged inconvenience, but Daniel responded with precise references to property law and association bylaws. "The association's concerns are noted," he said evenly, "but legal ownership cannot be by tradition or assumption. The principles of fairness, law, and clarity guide this decision." As the meeting progressed, murmurs of surprise and admiration began to ripple through the room. Neighbors who had previously criticized him realized that Daniel had acted with preparation, knowledge, and patience. Even those frustrated by the inconvenience could not dispute the logic and legality of his approach. The board's attempts to regain authority were met with calm clarity, leaving little room for argument. By the middle of the meeting, the atmosphere had shifted. The focus moved from confrontation to acknowledgement. Residents began to see Daniel not as a source of conflict, but as someone who had applied foresight, patience, and principle to resolve a complex situation. His careful management of access and insistence on legality had transformed a neighborhood dispute into a model of clear, fair governance. The final moments of the meeting were marked by a quiet, almost reluctant recognition of Daniel's authority. Mrs. and other board members acknowledged that the street was legally his and that their prior demands could not be enforced. Some board members expressed gratitude for his orderly and fair approach, while others quietly accepted the change without comment. The meeting concluded with applause from several residents, a mix of admiration and relief that the situation had reached resolution. As Daniel returned home, walking past his gate and the street he now owned, he felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The conflict had reached its climax, and he had emerged not through confrontation, but through preparation, patience, and principle. Drive had learned that boundaries, when managed with clarity and respect, could resolve tension more effectively than pressure or argument. That evening, Daniel stood behind his locked gate, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the street. He reflected on the journey, from a simple dispute over a gate to the acquisition of the street and the careful assertion of property rights. The final showdown had not been loud or chaotic. It had been deliberate, measured, and ultimately transformative. For Daniel Harper, this was the moment where quiet strategy had achieved lasting impact, and the neighborhood would never view boundaries or private property the same way again. The weeks following the annual meeting brought a sense of calm to Drive, a calm that felt different from before. The neighborhood had adjusted to the reality of Daniel Harper's ownership of the street. Cars no longer zipped through his property as a shortcut, and children found new paths to bike or walk to school. At first, there had been murmurs of frustration, but over time, the community began to accept the new order. Daniel, standing behind his locked gate each evening, observed the subtle changes with a quiet satisfaction. The gate, once a source of tension, now symbolized clarity and fairness. He had not acted out of spite or anger. His goal had been simple yet profound: to assert boundaries responsibly, uphold the law, and demonstrate that patience and preparation often achieved what force could not. The neighborhood had learned this lesson, some reluctantly, others with admiration, and Daniel took no joy in their discomfort, only in the knowledge that his approach had been measured and fair. Over time, a few residents approached him politely, seeking temporary access for particular needs. Daniel handled these requests with care, maintaining a schedule that was consistent and transparent. There were no arbitrary decisions, no favoritism, just clarity and fairness. He found that this approach, though it required effort, helped ease lingering tensions and fostered a sense of respect. People began to understand that boundaries, when set clearly and followed consistently, were easier to respect than those left vague or assumed. The Homeowners Association also experienced change. The board, humbled by the events surrounding Daniel's gate and street ownership, began to approach governance with a new perspective. Policies were reviewed, and members realized the importance of knowledge, preparation, and transparency when addressing residents' concerns. Mrs., the former president, continued to participate in meetings, but with a noticeably different approach, one that emphasized dialogue and understanding over pressure and assumption. Neighbors, too, started to adapt. Families discovered alternative routes and, in doing so, developed a stronger sense of self-reliance. The initial inconvenience gradually became routine, and many residents found that the extra effort offered unexpected benefits: safer streets, quieter driveways, and a renewed appreciation for the principle of private property. Conversations at block gatherings shifted from complaints to cautious acknowledgement of the new order, and some even expressed admiration for Daniel's steady, measured handling of the situation. Daniel's satisfaction was quiet but profound. Standing on his porch one late afternoon, he watched the sun dip behind the rooftops, casting long shadows over the street he now owned. The gate remained locked, the sign at the entrance clearly marking the boundaries, and life in the neighborhood moved forward with a sense of order that had been absent before. He reflected on the journey, from the initial HOA request to keep his gate open, to the research and discovery of the street's legal status, to the careful management of access and the eventual final showdown at the annual meeting. Each step had required patience, clarity, and foresight. He realized that the gate and the street had become more than symbols of property or ownership. They were a testament to principle. Daniel had demonstrated that quiet determination, guided by knowledge and law, could transform a situation without hostility or force. He had shown that respect for rules, for fairness, and for boundaries was more powerful than conflict or confrontation. As twilight settled over Drive, Daniel felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond personal victory. The neighborhood had adjusted, the streets had settled into a new rhythm, and a lesson had been quietly taught. Patience, preparation, and principled action could achieve lasting results. Daniel understood that this legacy would endure far beyond the moment, a model for navigating disputes, respecting boundaries, and asserting rights responsibly. The locked gate, once a point of tension, now stood as a silent sentinel over Drive. Residents respected it, adjusted to it, and gradually recognized its purpose. Daniel Harper, standing behind it with calm satisfaction, knew that he had done more than protect his property. He had set a standard for fairness, integrity, and quiet authority. The neighborhood had learned, in its own way, that boundaries were not obstacles to harmony but the foundation of it. And so life in Drive continued, reshaped by the patience and principle of one man who had refused to yield, yet had never sought conflict. The gate remained closed, the street managed carefully, and the lessons of respect, law, and foresight endured. Daniel Harper, behind his locked gate, smiled faintly, content in the knowledge that sometimes the quietest actions leave the most lasting impact. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.